So, unless you've avoided news of all kinds for the last 4 or 5 days, you probably know that things in the United States have gotten extremely intense. On top of a global 100-year pandemic, coronavirus, where the United States has been one of the worst hit countries, thanks in part to our failed federal leadership. We have seen the tragedy of George Floyd being killed by police in Minnesota set off a string of extreme civil unrest. And this includes examples of just about everything you can imagine, both by protesters and by those who are pretending to be protesters, but actually have nefarious intentions, and by police as well. And meanwhile, we are completely lacking anything that would be called leadership from the Oval Office, with Donald Trump doing everything from calling for pro-Trump protesters to gather at the White House on Saturday night, which they didn't, all the way to tweeting about essentially release the hounds, talking about Secret Service's vicious dogs that would be unleashed on protesters who breached the fence at the White House, up to and including flying to Florida and taking credit for a SpaceX launch of a Falcon 9 rocket carrying two astronauts to the International Space Station, while retweeting videos of himself talking about all of it Saturday as protests raged and buildings burned. And I really spent a lot of time this weekend thinking about what's the primary story here? What's like the main analysis that has to be done? What's the lens through which we need to understand what's happening in our country right now? Because I wanted to come to you and give you that point of view. Here's really what this is about. And the conclusion I came to is that there is no one lens. Things are more complicated than this is really what's going on. And I know that there are a ton of hot takes about this. If you look at Twitter lately, if you look at cable news, everybody claims to hold the real key. They claim to say this is the true filter through which this should all be seen. I'm here to tell you I don't have such a lens for you, because I believe any such lens is too simplistic. Now, if you want that simplistic analysis, there are plenty available. There's no question about it. But to some degree, we sometimes are blinded by narrative. And in some cases, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Meaning, if you want to see every issue as being related to one problem, you're able to find a way to do that, even if it's not really the right or most robust analysis. So I'm going to give you some examples, and then we'll get to what I think is a reasonable analysis and way to think about all of this. So one storyline we're hearing, and we've heard it from a lot of different people, is this is merely about race. This is about white cops killing black people. This is about white cops oppressing black protesters. This is about a fundamentally racist justice system. It's about a fundamentally racist society. That's what the lens is. Now, of course, race is a massive component that is causing understandable rage among a lot of people. But that analysis doesn't tell you everything that you need to know. Our economic system at its core, for example, functions to stymie and suppress real change and activism. And it goes way beyond race, has racial implications, of course, but you miss that if you make this only about race. Much of that economic system is certainly rooted in supremacies along racial lines, but a race-only analysis falls short. A lot of the hot takes we're seeing are only about race. Another perspective that is heavily represented is that this is really about capitalism, right? Any capitalist system is inevitably racist and inevitably leads to this degree of social unrest: arson, looting, property damage, police violence against protesters, protester violence against police, protester on protester violence, protesters versus looters. That the idea is that is because of a capitalist system. Making this simply about capitalism ignores the countless social democracies, right? Which that's a form of capitalism, it's regulated capitalism, that are some of the places where these issues of inequality and racial tensions have been best dealt with around the world. Some of the best examples, in fact, of functioning societies with reduced income inequality, reduced racial inequality, social safety nets, trust in institutions, less corruption. They are regulated versions of capitalism. So I believe that the capitalism analysis also fails. Another lens that's being presented as the lens is simply about police brutality, meaning this is about police brutality as what killed George Floyd. This is about police brutality as the problem in the protests. In other words, if it weren't for police brutality, George Floyd would be alive. If George Floyd were alive, we wouldn't be seeing these protests. We at the protests are also just seeing further police brutality. Now, there is no shortage of police brutality at the protests. What happened to George Floyd is unconscionable. But this is about so much more than that, including economic and racial issues. It's about the militarization of law enforcement in the United States. And there are people making it only about that. It's not only about that, but that's a part of it. When you militarize law enforcement, you create overly aggressive policing. You can argue that that played a role in George Floyd's death. Militarization is what led police in riot gear in dozens of cities over the weekend to use tear gas and rubber bullets, and to see media and random bystanders and even people peacefully protesting, which is, of course, their right to do, horribly injured by police. So militarization of law enforcement is another huge problem in the U.S. We've covered it, but it is not the only lens that we need to be using. So here's the reality when you think about this. And we often want things to be black and white. We want to say, this is what this is really about. The reality is this is a country of 331 million people. We have examples of everything you can imagine. We have dozens of different problems that relate to what we are now seeing. Just this weekend, we saw sickening violence done by police to protesters, including, for example, an elderly man with a cane shoved onto the ground by police. And we saw police, and I believe it was Michigan, show up and tell the protesters, I'm putting down my weapons. I'm with you. Let's march together. We saw protesters burn entire buildings and brutalize business owners, including middle-aged women. And yet we also saw protesters guard a police officer who was separated from his squad on Saturday night. And this is the risk about the out-of-context sharing of pictures and video on social media, 10 seconds from one protest and 15 from another. And I actually did some of this over the weekend, and I don't know that it was the best thing. Not only does it lack immediate context, it lacks broader context about all of the issues that have gotten us to where we are now, including, by the way, a complete lack of leadership from the president. And we're going to talk about that later, which is why I'm not digging into it too much right here. So my message is what we are seeing is mostly about systems, and it is less about individuals. You're seeing a ton of debates about what portion of police are good versus bad, which is very fraught terminology anyway, good and bad. What portion of protesters have good or bad intentions? What portion of protesters are grassroots members of the community versus out-of-town astroturfers, as has been a growing narrative over the weekend, used in part to discredit the real and justified anger that protesters have about what's going on in their communities. The problem is, if you just argue about that, if you spend your time on those questions, well, 82% of the protesters are good, or whatever you might say. You're not really digging into the systemic elements at play. If we figure out it's 85% of the protesters that are good instead of 80, then what? It's good fodder for corporate media. It does little for anybody else. So I don't pretend to have one single unifying theory about this. This is what it's really about, and at the exclusion of other things. That's not something you're going to hear from me. But what I can tell you for sure is that you won't understand any of this if you don't understand the context. And that's where a lot of the local news coverage of the protests has failed, which is a complete lack of context. Oh, somebody looted a cheesecake factory and they came out with a cheesecake. That's coverage that we saw. Doesn't really tell us anything about what's going on. So racialized policing combined with a two-tiered justice system for rich and poor, a system that focuses on street crime at the exclusion of white-collar crime, combined with an economic system that doesn't work for a huge portion of the country, in addition to right now having nearly 25% unofficial unemployment in the midst of a 100-year pandemic, in addition to a complete absence of federal leadership from a president who tweeted all weekend from his bunker at the White House, combined with corporate media that really is seeking to foment division rather than find solutions, doesn't it's not a good recipe. And then you add to that militarized law enforcement that seems to always have money, despite we supposedly lacking our supposed lack of money for healthcare and education. It's all of that stuff together. Now, I want to be really clear. This is not like a social justice intersectionality analysis of race and gender and it's not that. What it is an understanding that we have systems in our country that are bigger than any one protest or any one police officer. And only with that multi-focused perspective can you really get anything that we would call an all-encompassing analysis. Let me give you another example of a false debate. Riots are good versus riots are bad, or riots are effective versus the riots are ineffective, or they are criminal or they are heroic. First of all, a ton of this debate is actually semantic in terms of some people are arguing over whether riots are good or bad. Others are arguing over what counts as a riot versus a protest. There's racialization of the language. There's a lack of context, etc. But what you really have to understand is you can simultaneously say, I'm against violence, both against people and property. I believe it is unlikely that the violence will achieve much. And yet, at the same time, I understand that people have had it and I get what's going on, right? Someone's son is killed by police and then a window gets smashed. It's hard to feel like these things are equivalent in any way without needing to endorse property damage. We can understand that people have absolutely had it. People are sick and tired of the status quo. And while I might not think we will achieve change by breaking windows, I understand and sympathize with the absolute anger and disgust with these systems that protesters have. Now, I have to tell you, the argument that the unrest has accomplished nothing, I don't know if it's a good argument. You all know that I have always said I favor legal protests. I'm against violence, including against most forms of property crime. Over the weekend, we saw the officer who killed George Floyd, Derek Chauvin, arrested. We saw Fox News Sunday devote an hour to the protests, to George Floyd, and to how coronavirus disproportionately affects communities of color with guest Cornel West. I don't know that were it not for the national unrest, we would have seen that be the Fox News Sunday show. I don't know. I think that what we're seeing played a role in what Fox News even decided to do on Sunday. Would we have seen Derek Chauvin get arrested? Would we potentially be seeing the other 3 officers get arrested were it not for this degree of unrest? I don't know is the question. It's less clear to me that this has accomplished nothing. And that is separate from whether these are tactics that I condone. Last thing, and I want to be really clear here. This is not like some kumbaya segment where everyone's thoughts are equally valid and everyone is equally responsible for what's going on. That's not what this is. But what we need to understand is that the word privilege is often thrown around. You're privileged if you say cops are mostly good and protect you, because a lot of people live in places where the cops aren't primarily there to protect you, or at least it certainly doesn't feel that way if you're part of certain communities. Or you're privileged to be against property crime during protests because you live somewhere safe and the systems work for you and you can't possibly imagine what it's like to actually be in the position that a lot of the protesters are in. In some way, all of those allegations are correct, and yet this is not so much about individual privilege. It's, again, systems that aren't working for large swaths of people. And that gets me to my last thought. In history, we've seen unrest lead to movements which lead to activism, which will often enter the political and legal space, which at some point will end up being decided by a judge somewhere. Look at Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark decision that said states can't segregate schools by race. That was in 1954. It started in 1951 in Kansas. It involved 3 years of activism, protests, consensus building, and eventually it was a Supreme Court decision under Earl Warren that decided 9-0 on the court, schools can't racially segregate. as we figure out what needs to happen next, do not miss the forest for the trees that may come 1, 2, or 3 years down the line. If what is going on now will lead to change, it may come down to who is on the Supreme Court in 1, 2, or 3 years. I don't even have to tell you what that means about a decision we all have to make 5 months from now, because you all know exactly what that decision is.